We are live now, ma'am.
Okay. Namaste and good evening, friends. In this evening's edition of CLS Conversations, we have none other than Ashwin Sagi with us. Warm welcome to you, Ashwin ji.
Thank you, Sumita ji. And it's such a pity that we are not sitting on the beautiful lawns of Chandigarh Lake Club and having
I
this
was going.
conversation. But unfortunately, what to do? We will have to make do with this distant conversation.
Yes, and we are going to have to invite you back to Chandigarh and the Lake Club very soon as things normalize a bit. Ashwin ji needs no introduction. He is one of India's top selling English fiction authors. All his books have gone on to be bestsellers. He's also written two books in collaboration with James Patterson, which have gone on to be New York Times list bestsellers. He is the winner of the Popular Choice Award and numerous other accolades. He's often been called India's Dan Brown. And his books are a roller coaster, heady mix of mythology, science, history, politics, and thrills. So, Ashwinji, you alluded to your long and lovely association with CLS before I could, because I wanted to tell our viewers that when we had our first Lit Fest, Literati, at the Lake Club in Chandigarh way back in 2013, you were one of our biggest attractions. And then subsequently, you've come to Literati more than once, and every time it's such an engaging session with you. So naturally, our viewers are looking forward to this.
I am also looking forward to having a very, very interesting conversation with you. But let me tell you, to a very great extent, the reason why CLS and why Literati have worked so beautifully is because of the immense passion that you bring into organizing that entire exercise. I have been to
That's
thousands of festivals, but let me tell you, the excitement that is palpable when one is at Literati is always very, very evident. And a lot of the credit goes to you, Sumita ji.
No, it's all teamwork. We have a great team, a very enthusiastic team, as you rightly pointed out. And it's all for all of each one of us, it's purely voluntary work. Nobody gets paid, other than, of course, our vendors. But everything else is a labor of love and passion, as you have rightly, identified it. But normally a chat like this starts with, how did you get into writing, blah, blah. We are going to get there later on. But right now, I'm reading The Vault of Vishnu, and I literally had goosebumps with the eerie prophetic nature of that book, or the eerie similarity with some of the events that we are seeing around us, especially on the Indo-China border.
Yeah.
So how did the idea of this book emerge?
Uh, Frankly, I must tell you, Sumita ji, when I was thinking about the next book that I would write, the idea about exploring the India-China relationship had been something which was on my mind for a very, very long time. And it had actually started with just a simple and a rather comical sort of question that, यार हम जब चाय पीते हैं तो चाय भी, the word chai also comes from China, and the word chini, which we put the sugar inside it, वो भी China से ही है.
Yeah.
What has, why have we adopted? Why have we adopted these words? And there was always that thought that I would look at that particular relationship. It is unfortunate that today we are having this discussion at a time when that relationship is at an all-time low.
Yes.
But the truth of the matter is that our relationship with China, unfortunately, gets defined by the last 50, 70 odd years, uh, which is typically from the time of Chairman Mao and thereon. That's pretty much what is the defining period of time that we consider to be the India-China relationship. But what is often forgotten in the process is the fact that you had this great Pallava prince called Bodhidharma, who went from South India, traveled via Cambodia, eventually reached the monastery of Shaolin, sat in a cave for 9 years meditating, used Indian martial arts like Silambam and Kalaripayattu along with yogic meditation in order
And
to
you've written all that in your book. You have that meticulous
resulted,
research is there.
eventually resulted in Kung Fu. We forget about the fact that Buddhism would not have spread to the rest of the world had it not first traveled from India to China and then from China to the rest of the world. We forget the fact that sugar did not exist in China at the time that Xuanzang traveled into India. But we also forget the fact that the first sugar refining unit in West Bengal was set up by a Chinese man in the village of Achipur. And similarly, to a very great extent, we also have a tendency to completely forget the long cultural exchanges, including, for example, the concept of silk, which came as an import from China into India.
Yeah.
So there has been the relationship has been on multiple levels. The problem, unfortunately, of course, is that while one country decided to move decisively forward in terms of its economic and military prowess, the other country did not take a page out of the Chinese book. I have always viewed, one of my most famous books was Chanakya's Chant, and the Chanakya's Chant was based on a work of Kautilya called the Arthashastra. Yes. And of course, the Chinese, particularly in their defense academies, have treated Arthashastra as serious reading. Unfortunately, we did not do the same with the Art of War and Sun Tzu, which is what we should have been doing along the way. So
we haven't been reading Arthashastra either. So we have pretty much left both these great works to one side.
So to a very great extent, I mean, it was Sun Tzu who said that, the best way of fighting a war is to appear powerful when you are weak and to appear weak when you are powerful. And
yes, you can see that in the book.
Being entirely, implemented on the Chinese side, whereas we can't even get our statements right. So
yes.
This is really the core of it, that unfortunately we are at the low point of that relationship. And if we really want this relationship to be on an even footing, we first need to set ourselves right before we can do anything else.
I think that's a very, very strong point that you're making, and that so much of offense and defense is perception and psychological, and that also has to be factored into the strategy that we are devising, not only vis-a-vis China.
No, and it frankly, Sumita ji, it irritates me no end. The fact that even till today, when we are in a moment of crisis, whether it is our press, whether it is our media, whether it is our opposition parties, whether it is intelligent voices, cannot understand this one simple fact that at this point of time, no matter what you may think, you need to present a united front.
Yes.
In moments like this, you need to be united. And it just, I feel helpless at times. And at times I really wish I put out a Facebook post 3 days ago where I said that, that first chapter of The Vault of Vishnu, where I'm describing massacre on the Indo-China border. There is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, a 10th or 15th chapter where I'm talking about a laboratory in Beijing where certain designs are being produced. And frankly, it's a little unnerving. In fact, it's taken me a lot of time to sort of recover from that, because in some funny sort of way, you feel that how dare you have written something like this? How dare you wrote it? Are you taking pleasure out of the fact that your soldiers died on the border? It has been a very, very unnerving experience for me, because unfortunately that fiction has come too close to fact.
That's what I was saying. It's eerie. It gave me goosebumps the very first chapter where you write that they were attacked and killed without gunshots. That one sentence itself, is echoing in my head. And you I mean, you wonder whether this is the voice of Saraswati in some way coming out through
No,
fiction.
I don't think Ma Saraswati could have wanted any of this, and she would certainly not have wanted me to predict any of this. So, I mean, in that sense, it is just a very, very unfortunate coincidence. But the point, I guess, is sometimes we as fiction writers are also looking in some ways at what is happening on the ground, and our fiction tends to also be influenced, because let us not forget that Doklam had already happened by the time I was writing Vault of Vishnu. So in that sense, it is fact that influences fiction, and then unfortunately at times fiction then ends up influencing fact.
True. Going back now in time, you've been involved in your family business since you were 16, which is what my reading up tells me. You went on to get an MBA from the prestigious Yale School of Management. So what or who led you to becoming a writer, and that too in such a complex genre, I would say?
Frankly, Sumita ji, I think there are two people. One, of course, is my maternal granduncle, my Nanaji, as it were. In fact, I was closer to, within our family, we always called him Majle Nanaji because he was the middle brother.
Yeah, middle one.
And so Majle Nanaji was not my real Nanaji. He was my Nanaji's elder brother. And he was the one who actually, to a very great extent, was very fond of reading as well as writing. He was multilingual because he spoke English, Hindi, French, German, Persian, Urdu, and Sanskrit. So he was truly a well-read, जिसे कहते हैं विद्वान. He was truly a विद्वान. But he had this, he was part of a business family, and his family was running multiple textile mills in Uttar Pradesh at that point of time. So, but despite that, he always took out time for reading and writing. And Nanaji had this habit of sending me a book every week, which he would very lovingly send on a train. On Monday they had an executive always coming from Kanpur to Bombay. So a book would accompany that particular executive, who would make sure that it was dropped to me. And what Nanaji expected in return was a letter that would go from me to him, which explained what I had read 2 weeks ago and whether I liked it or disliked it and why I liked or disliked it. So it was the earliest form of really writing up a book review.
Yes. He got you reading as well as distilling your impressions of that book.
And you know, sometimes really wonder, I have a 16-year-old son. Even though he is living under the same roof as me, for my dear life, I cannot get him to pick up a book. And
I'm laughing already because this sounds familiar.
And I'm not able to also give him the sort of time that Majle Nanaji gave me, even though he was sitting, a few hundred miles away in North India. But today, when I think back at it, the amount of input and the amount of time and the amount of patience that the old man gave to me, over his lifetime, he sent me a little over 300, 350 odd books. And so this was one part of it. And these were books which were way ahead of my age, really, in that sense, because there were books like, for example, War and Peace. There were books like A Tale of Two Cities. There were works of Umar Khayyam. There was Paramahans Yoganand.
Very broad categories.
It was a wide range of books on history, mythology, philosophy, on the classics, and so many other things. And then, in parallel to what Nanaji was doing, was my own dear mother, who never ever was bothered about trying to read something which was what I would put into the classification of evolved. Mom's reading was always about entertainment. So it was the latest Jeffrey Archer or Sidney Sheldon or Irving Wallace or Frederick Forsyth or Ken Follett. Whatever happened to be the latest paperback, Mom would read it and then pass it on to me. Now, what I didn't know, so in some ways, the content the content, the philosophy, the knowledge that was coming to me from Nanaji was tempered by the style and the pace and the formula of the other stuff that I was reading, which was coming to me from mom. And I think
which is also very readable stuff. I mean, all of those bestsellers are so readable.
Exactly. So in that sense, if you really ask me, my writing is a combination of those two. That you will get moments of deep philosophy, you will get moments of trying to correlate history or mythology or science, but you will also find that the overwhelming desire to keep you glued to the page, to get you to turn the page.
So your first book, The Rosable Line, was a pretty complex subject for a first book, and you published it under a pseudonym, and you
Yes.
self-published it. So what's
Yes.
the story behind that?
So, I like to joke with a lot of people because, I mean, I came from this entire family, which was this business family. Nanaji, of course, was prompting me towards, making sure that he would always say कि बेटा तुम्हारे लाइफ में तुम लक्ष्मी की तो पूजा करोगे ही करोगे, बट माँ सरस्वती की अगर पूजा कर लोगे तो लक्ष्मी जी खुद ब खुद आके तुम्हारे पास बैठ जाएंगी, वो विराजमान हो जाएंगी तुम्हारे पास.
So has that happened?
I don't. Well, I mean, I have been, in that sense, I have been truly blessed because both the Devi Jis have remained. दोनों की कृपा रही है मुझ पे. But in that sense, when I started out writing sometime around 2002, 2003, at that point of time, I had no real exposure to the literary world. I didn't come from a family of writers, as it were, published writers. I had no one really backing me, and as a result of which, most literary agents and publishers turned down my first book, The Rosabal Line. And in fact, I mean, that was a saga of almost about 2 years or so before I could eventually find a publisher. But before I could even find a publisher, I had already got fed up of this entire literary process. It sometimes feels a little bit, Sumita ji, like Agni Pariksha. How much of my testing will you keep doing? So I had reached that point about 5 or 6 months before I eventually got published, that no, I'm going to forget about all of this and self-publish it. And I had got so dejected and so depressed with this whole thing that I eventually thought कि मेरे नाम में ही कुछ खोट है, कुछ problem है अश्विन सांघी के नाम में ही. So then in those days, I used to be very fond of playing Scrabble. So I took all the letters of Ashwin Sanghi, and I put them on a Scrabble board, and then I jumbled them up and I said, let me see if I can create another name which has all the letters of Ashwin Sanghi, so that it's Ashwin Sanghi, but it's still not Ashwin Sanghi. And the first name that I came up with was Sean Higgins, which sounded very Scottish. So I said, अच्छा ठीक है, वैसे भी ये अमेरिका में पब्लिश करना है, क्या फर्क पड़ता है? Sean Higgins. Okay. So that is how that name was for the self-published title, it was Sean Higgins. But by the time that Westland eventually came into the picture in 2008, they said, Ashwin, it's going to be very difficult to promote this book with the name Sean Higgins because we will have to press conferences and so many other things. We'll have to give 10 explanations. So he said, why are you doing this? So I like to joke that the first murder that happened in an Ashwin Sanghi book was that of Mr. Sean Higgins.
Well said. One of the things that is always, awe-inspiring in your books is the sheer breadth of research. You can literally see the research in every paragraph that you write. What is your process? How much time, or how do you go about it? How do you weave in all the different places and timelines that your books normally have?
If you really think about it, there have been till now, there have been 6 books in the Bharat series. And these 6 books have taken me about 12 years to write. So it's been an average of about 2 years between books. Within the 2 years, normally for me, the first 9 months to 12 months is spent on research. The next 2 to 3 months is spent on plotting the book. And finally, about 6 months is spent on writing the book. The last 3 months is spent on rewriting and editing. So
Editing.
that's roughly mota mati what the way the structure for those 2 years is. But within that first 9 or 12 months of research, how does that process work? I'll go into a little more detail. Typically, it will start with an idea. Now, very often what happens with most writers is that they start looking for ideas when they sit down to write a book. In my case, I realize that my best ideas come when I'm not planning to write a book. So I could be having this conversation with you, and you may end up asking me a particular question that really resonates with me. And I'm wondering, how did Sumita ji ask me this question? Maybe this is something I need to explore. So I will end up emailing myself at the end of this session something that you may have asked and may have struck my fancy. I will do that with an interesting paragraph that I read in a book. It could be a video that I watch online. It could be traveling to a particular city and seeing a monument that suddenly strikes my fancy. I'll take a picture and I'll email myself. Over the years, I've emailed myself around 10,000 plus times. And so these are the ideas which sort of make their way into an idea bank. Once I actually start the process of looking at a new book, that I go back to my idea bank and I look for those ideas which I think are of the nature where I can really sort of develop my research on them. The nature of the research for each book will tend to differ, Sumita ji. So, for example, a book like, let's say, Chanakya's Chant, mostly the research was reading of the Arthashastra and the Mudra Rakshas. These two, and multiple reading, and that pretty much then took care of everything else. In the case of the Krishna Key, it was a reading of the Mahabharata as well as the Bhagavad Puran. Also, visiting places like, let's say, Somnath, Dwarka, Bet Dwarka, Vrindavan, Mathura, and so on and so forth. In the case of, let's say, Sialkot Saga, I mean, these two stories play out in the last 70 years of post-independence India, and that too specifically in Bombay and Calcutta. So I didn't only want the historical information about these cities, but I also wanted people who had lived through the 1950s and 60s and 70s of Bombay and Calcutta so that they could tell me the things which the books don't tell me.
Yes. Yeah.
Or, for example, Keepers of the Kal Chakra. I didn't know the first thing about quantum theory, so I spent 6 months with a friend who was an IIT engineer in order to understand as to what are the basics of quantum theory. So each book will have a different type of focus in terms of research. But the amount of time that is needed for the research will be around roughly the same.
Sorry for interrupting, but is it true that the idea for the Keepers of the Kal Chakra came via a nightmare you had?
Sure. I mean, I got up one day, it was about 3 or 4 in the morning, and I woke up drenched in sweat because it was a terrible nightmare. In fact, most dreams and nightmares, it's very difficult for you to be able to remember them later.
Yes. Yeah.
For most people, you ask them, what did you dream about? And they can't really tell you what was in the dream.
Images. It's very jumbled. Yeah.
But this was so real that I almost felt that, and then I hung on to the thought. And, and I made a note of it on my Apple iPhone that, this is what I sort of remembered. And the next morning, I discussed it with my wife and I said, Anu, this particular dream that was there, it felt that it was so real. And the question that popped up into my head at that moment was that, could that dream have been my reality? Could that be the reality? And could the conversation that I'm having with you right now, could this be my dream? And it resulted in a sort of a confusion between what we call the real state and the dream state almost. And that is what then led me into that further exploration of quantum theory in order to try and figure out as to whether that had been dealt with in the realm of quantum theory. So, yes, I mean, it was that. That was the genesis. That was the genesis.
It was a nightmare. I read somewhere that you call yourself you also call yourself the overlap guy. What does that mean?
Well, what it means really is that for me, mythology, people think that I'm interested in mythology, like let's say the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, or they think that I'm interested in history in terms of, let's say, for example, the revolt of 1857 or the independence movement, or in terms of, let's say, the Mughal era. But frankly, for me, none of these subjects in and of themselves are of excitement. So, for example, when you tell me that, listen, the Mahabharata is a great event from an epic, but there are also historical pointers which indicate that some of those events could have been real. So they could have been historical events. Then that's the point at which there is an overlap between mythology and history. So, for example, if you tell me that, listen, some of our works in the Purans tell us that levitation is possible, but now there is an Oxford study which says that human levitation is possible. Then it's an overlap between the world of philosophy and the world of science. So for me, it is the overlap between multiple compartments that causes the excitement. The adrenaline rush does not come from one particular compartment. It comes from the possible overlap between multiple compartments. That's why I call myself the overlap guy.
That's a very fascinating answer, and it shows that you're able to deal with a lot of complexity at the same time and then make it simple and understandable to your readers, which is, I think, the skill of the writer.
Frankly, to my mind, that is, in fact, in the simplicity of your question, you have actually hammered the nail on its head. How do you convey a complex idea to the average reader? Take, for example, something like the concept of nothingness. I mean, spirituality always, philosophy and spirituality talks about nothingness. But if you read Keepers of the Kal Chakra, how do I explain nothingness to today's generation? I say, listen, guys, all of you use tablets and iPhones and Androids and, iPad. All of our screens tend to get smudgy with our fingerprints.
Yeah.
But the question that arises is that, do you see your fingerprints on the screen when the screen is active and on, or do you see it when the screen is off?
Yes.
So the reality of the world is only visible to you. The fingerprints on the screen, as it were, are only visible to you when the screen is off. The moment you have moving images and the moment you have videos and the moment you have high resolution images on your screen, you do not notice the smudges. You do not notice your prints. Now, I have to find metaphors like that in order to be able to explain the stuff I'm talking about. Or, for example, the concept within quantum theory about the observer and the observed. And in fact, this is something which is even spoken about within the Upanishads. How do you explain something like that to someone whose life probably is far more in the here and now in the material world? And so I say, well, guys, you all use Google for your search. So you go on Google and you enter a search term, and Google starts throwing up an auto-populated list of the search terms as you are typing. But do you realize that auto-populated list is not only the algorithm of Google, but that your search is actually having an effect on the algorithm?
Yes.
So in that sense, you think that you are the observed, but the truth is that because you are the observer, you are having an effect on the observed. So, I mean, one has to find ways to make material more reachable to today's generation, and that's what I try to do.
And I think the examples you've given are one that this digitally clued in generation will be able to immediately understand and absorb,
Absolutely.
Moving a little, you've written 2 books in collaboration with James Patterson, and both have gone on to be New York Times bestsellers. And so I wanted to know how difficult, and the books for everyone's knowledge are Private India and then Private Delhi. How difficult was it to write in collaboration? And whose literary style prevailed, or how did you sort of, keep off each other's territories? How did that whole, process work? And that too, when you're in separate continents, maybe? I mean, you're not sitting together physically and writing.
Sure. I think what is very important when you are writing along with someone, when it's far easier to sing a song when you are a solo singer, but if you are singing as part of a choir or if you are singing as a jugalbandi, then you have to watch each other's notes,
Yes.
so that you produce harmony. Otherwise, those notes can sound very discordant. In that sense, I think the critical element is that both of you have to be on the same page. Excuse the pun, but you have to be on the same page in that sense. I think the critical element is the way I visualize the process of writing with someone is that, let's say I happen to be located in Bombay and James happens to be in Delhi, and both of us start walking towards one another over thousands of miles, and we decide that we are going to meet somewhere in the middle. If we are going to meet somewhere in the middle, we need to have the GPS coordinates of the place where we will meet. We need to know the day and time on which we will meet each other. And we need to be very clear in terms of how much time it's going to take each one of us to be able to get there, so that we are taking the same amount of time in order to be able to meet. Now, that means, in other words, you plan your writing journey. And that is very critical. The great thing about working along with Patterson is that he has done this umpteen number of times. So he is truly a master of working collaboratively. So with James, it's very clear. Author A works on the plot outline. Author B then revises the plot outline. Author A, it comes back to author A, and the plot outline finally gets sort of frozen. But whoever is the one who has written the plot outline is not the one who writes the first draft. So the first draft is written by author B.
Okay.
And then, of course, author A comes in order to provide his revisions and inputs and edits. And so in the process, you have both the voices, but with very, very distinct spheres of operation. And so both Private India and Private Delhi worked in very different ways. In the case of Private India, I worked on the plot outline and James wrote the first draft, whereas in the second book, it was his outline and I wrote the first draft. So, the sequence of events was slightly different. What is very critical, though, is that I think at a deeper level, both James and I complement each other. In some ways, I am much more of a कारीगर. वो जयपुर और मुगल मिनिएचर्स होते हैं ना, जहाँ पर बहुत वो लोग उसको बनाते हैं. On the other hand, James is much more like an M.F. Hussain, taking a big brush and just giving broad brush strokes on the canvas. And then you're trying to combine those two very, very distinctive styles. So I think James is a master of pace and plot and how to enhance suspense. I think in my own ways over the years, I have become truly, in some ways, far more focused on things like detailing and research and making things sound very, very real. And, even if you have to telling that lie in a way where it's very, very believable.
And filling in that tapestry of the book.
And spinning that in. So I think that if you both are good at one thing, then it's difficult to really produce something that is going to be worthwhile.
So what I gather from that is that it is both challenging, but it is also a process of growth for both individually as well as a team. Because you explore a facet of your writing or authorship which you would not if you were just going solo.
Absolutely.
So are you a fan of detective fiction writing or the genre itself? And do you have any favorite fictional characters or detectives which you love to read?
Too many to narrate in a single interview. But let me put it this way. I think to a very great extent, I've been one of those who, I think on the one hand, I have a lot of books where Sumita ji, where I have sort of gained a lot from them. So, like, for example, books like, let's say, Autobiography of a Yogi, or books like Freedom at Midnight, or books like Midnight's Children. Those are books which are all-time classics where I learned something from them. But on the other hand, I mean, if you really think in terms of books which have sort of influenced my style, as it were, I mean, today, if you think of, for example, Silence of the Lambs, or you think of Da Vinci Code, or Boris Starling's Messiah, or Robin Cook's Coma, or I mean, the first book I read of James Patterson, Kiss the Girls, I cannot not forget it. Robert Ludlum with The Bourne Identity. I mean, Tom Clancy, The Hunt for Red October. I mean, that list is endless. I mean, I could spend the next half an hour telling you which are those books, but then we would only be talking about that.
Great. Your books have a very strong feminine principle. And personally, that's something I love. But can you tell us the thinking or the thought behind this?
There are two parts to this answer. Part A, part B. Part A really is in terms of what do I consider to be the feminine power or Shakti. For me, it's actually far simpler than for a lot of other people, because I do not see the world in dualities. People mostly think in terms of the world as light or dark, hot or cold, good or evil, all of that. मुझे ये dualities actually ज़्यादा समझ में नहीं आते हैं, because for me, when I look at the concept of, let's say, light and dark, for me, dark is simply the absence of light. Or when I think of, for example, heat and cold, I think of cold as simply the absence of heat. Or when I think of someone who's wise versus someone who's foolish, I simply think that, well, the person who's foolish has a lack of wisdom. In that sense, for me, Shiva and Shakti are not opposites. I think of Shiva as the absence of Shakti. So in that sense, what we consider
your process is much more dynamic, because if somebody is not wise, they can get to being wise.
Exactly.
It's not frozen.
In other words, when we talk of male power, it is someone who simply has not got that level of Shakti within them, so they can work towards having a higher level of Shakti. So when you start thinking of it in that form, then your appreciation of the concept of Shakti becomes that much greater. So this is one part of it, part A of the answer. Part B of the answer is that for me, I have been surrounded in my life by female figures that inspired, that adored me, that I adored them. I mean, it was as simple as that. So I would say probably at the top of that list was my mother, who, without her, I would have probably not even considered the idea of exploring the world of literary pursuit. Because she brought in that sensibility that, hey, listen, just because you're born in a business family doesn't mean that you have to be a businessman. I think probably if I think about it, the second element in that would be my wife, because had it not been for Anu, I would have never made the plunge or taken the plunge. That first book, The Rosabal Line, I still remember we were on holiday in Goa when she put the laptop in front of me and she said, "Do you realize that you're obsessed with the Rosabal story? And there is really no reason as to why you can't write up a book on it." If I think about my blood sister, who is 7 years older to me, she was a person who, during my struggle years, when no one was really appreciating what I was writing, she told me, she said that, listen, do what your heart tells you. Don't be focused on what other people around you are saying. I have a Rakhi sister who is exactly 7 years younger to me, and she brings in that level of I would say mischievousness. There are times when I'll discuss ideas with her. There are times when I simply, at a certain point of time, I simply want to get a sense which is completely unhinged, a view which is completely unhinged, and she brings that into my life. And then, of course, there is at the top of them all, there's Ma Saraswati herself, because sometimes when I write and I look at the pages that I've written and I wonder कि भाई तुमने क्या लिखा, and you say, अरे अश्विन तुमने क्या काबिलियत है? You have zero capacity to be able to think like this. At that moment when you thought like this and you wrote this, were you writing it or were you simply channelizing something that Ma gave you? So these are all the various elements of Shakti which have been there in my life, without which I would be really nothing.
Well, I must add that on a very pragmatic level, as a reader, I like the message that comes across of women as empowered, complex, and equally human individuals. I mean, as opposed to the default being male, here
Yes.
there is also the option of women in an equal space, and that is, I think, a very empowering message.
And it's very strange because I know this may sound a little cliched, Sumita ji, but the truth of the matter is that women should not compare themselves to men because they are so much more. I mean, and you know, our entire history, philosophy, culture, mythology has pointed to this. It pains me no end that this is a country which worships Shakti, which worships Durga, which worships Parvati, Saraswati, Lakshmi, all of that in our temples. We devote 9 nights to Navratri, but we have forgotten to worship the real Shakti in our lives. I mean, it is just such a terrible twist of fate that this country needs to go back to its roots, and it needs to remember as to what was the real value system that it was brought up with.
In fact, as I said, that's one of the things I like about your books. The fact that the women characters are full-blooded human beings without judgments attached, which is the norm for us in India. Especially, you know, there's centuries of value judgments attached to female behavior. That apart, coming to what you just said at the end, so running through all your books, is there, you sort of contextualize the wealth of the past, of our mythology, our spirituality, into modern times, into present times. So is there a bigger message that you're trying to convey, especially through the Bharat series, to your readers? And would you like to highlight that, if so?
Sure. In some ways, I think the approach that I take is that, hey, listen, you know, history repeats itself, and that ultimately it's always about patterns, and those patterns tend to repeat themselves. Sumita ji, you know, I think it was the writer George Orwell who in 1984, in his book 1984, he said, he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. So really think about this, that I mean, it is to a very great extent historians who control the past, and it is that past ka narrative which determines in some ways the way the future will play out. But the truth of the matter is that today's control, the control of the present, is in politics, lies in politics. And politics in some ways determines the historical narrative. I believe to a very great extent that over the years what's happened is that we have got used to one-sided narratives. And what I'm trying to do is basically, I mean, look at what has been happening in the last month or so with the number of statues that have been pulled down all over the world. Isn't that a sense of frustration, that why are people saying that, hey, listen, we don't want to revere Christopher Columbus because Christopher Columbus at the end of the day was not as great as you make him out to be. And why should we not why should we not question, for example, Robert Clive or Winston Churchill or Mahatma Gandhi or Columbus? I mean, we are well within our rights to question those one-sided narratives. So I think to a very great extent, what we really need to be doing is we need to allow counter narratives to also come to the fore. That is what has been to a very great extent missing. And every historian, no matter what the political dispensation, has been guilty of that. When you have a left-wing dispensation, then you have left-wing historical narratives. When you have a right-wing dispensation, then you have right-wing historical narratives. So in that sense, I don't consider history to really be history. It was George Santayana who said that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. We may laugh at it, but the truth of the matter is that history has been guilty of omissions and commissions. In that sense, I consider history, the word I use is not history, but distry. Distry meaning distorted history. Everyone has distorted it according to their respective ideologies, their prejudices, their views. The only way to rectify this is to be able to provide enough, let 1,000 narratives flourish. And that's the only way. The answer does not lie in rewriting history. It does not lie in saying that, hey, listen, because this was written by a dispensation which was left-wing, we are going to bring this one down. No. Provide the alternative and provide reasoning as to why there is an alternative. And that's what I try to do. Unfortunately, they say there's the old joke which says that, the only thing that we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. So what I'm trying to do is trying to in some ways rectify that.
Yes, you're trying to bring in those narratives which have been forgotten and hidden over time and over the years of colonial rule and all the other dispensations. Coming to my last question, and this has been such a fascinating journey. I mean, the last question obviously is a cliche which you must have been asked 100 times. You're looked up as by hundreds and thousands of aspiring authors. So what advice would you give them, whether practical or ideational? What would be your advice to them?
Well, I would say probably 5 or 6 bulleted points. Number one, that too many people think about writing, but they don't write. So stop thinking about writing, but write. I mean, too many people analyze, can I be a writer? What should I write about? But the answer is not that. You can't learn swimming by sitting on the side of the pool. You have to jump in. So start writing. It could be short stories. It could be an essay. It could be 280 character tweets. It could be a Facebook post. It could be a blog post. Get into the habit of writing, number one.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. You said habit. Sorry to interrupt. You said habit. So does that mean one should be writing every day, every weekend, or there should be a routine or predictability about it?
It is important during the early days to force yourself into a routine, because then it becomes almost natural. It becomes almost mechanical. I mean, in one of my books, which was 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck, I talked about Malcolm Gladwell's 10K rule, which is that devote 10,000 hours of your life to anything and you'll become an expert at it. So the more you write, I've always considered myself as a work in progress. I'm never shooting for that ultimately perfect book. I'm just shooting that I should be 2 or 3% better than my last book. That's all. So the more you'll write, the better you will begin to understand that it's not only an art, but it's also a craft. So that is one. I would say point number 2 is that don't worry too much about what people will say or what people will think. Any creative work that you put out there will always have its own fair share of critics. All that you want as a creative person is A, to be personally satisfied with it, and number 2, to have a vast majority of people being happy with it. So, but that there will always be, even with the finest movie or the finest book or the finest painting, there will be that 10, 20, 30% of people who say this is nonsense. So don't worry about it. That is the second point I want to make. Third point is that please don't lose the day job. It's all very well to be poetic and to think, oh, I'm going to do such a wonderful job and मैं इसमें से अपनी रोटी रोजी कमा लूंगा. It doesn't happen that way. The world of writing is very, very non-remunerative. It takes a lot of time before your royalty check will be able to sustain you and your lifestyle. So it makes sense. And writing is one of those things you can do for 2 hours at any time of the day. You can do it in the middle of the night. I wrote the Rosabal line between 10 o'clock and 12:30 every night. So there's no big deal. You can do it anytime. But it's very, very difficult to write when you are hungry. So keep the income flowing, keep the day job going, and write along with it. The day your writing income can sustain you, that's the day to give up the day job. That is point number 3. Point number 4 is that I think over a period of time, I think it's very easy to start floating the moment success comes. And it becomes I, me, myself. And people forget the fact that ultimately there was a creative muse. There was a greater power that was helping you, that was guiding you, that was actually putting those words on the pages. And it's very easy to lose connection with that creative muse. Call her Saraswati, call her Shakti, call her whatever you want. It's very easy to lose that connection. So it's so important that on your journey, keep your feet firmly on the ground, remain humble, and always have an intimate understanding of the fact that you were simply a channel, simply a medium through which those words came.
Thank you so much. As our viewers might have realized, that Ashwin ji is a truly humble person, and his humility, his frankness is what is so engaging and so endearing. Thank you so much, Ashwin ji. I hope our viewers have enjoyed this free, frank, and stimulating conversation as much as I have. And thank you again very much. Thank you, viewers, and we'll be back with another edition of CLS Conversations. Namaste.
Thank you, Sumita ji, and hopefully the next conversation that we have will be on the lawns of the Lake Club in Chandigarh, in your beautiful little city. And I look forward to meeting you in person. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Namaskar and thank you.